Mail-order bride was sent back for being too old, the lonely rancher said, then just be mine. The sun rose slowly over the vast plains, spilling golden light across the rugged land. On this quiet ranch the wind whispered through the tall grasses, and the distant hills seemed to hold secrets of the past. The rancher, a man in his late 40s named Thomas, stood on the porch of his weathered wooden house. His eyes followed the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, yet despite the calm beauty of his surroundings, a deep loneliness weighed on him. Thomas had always been a hard worker, a man of the land, but the years had left him alone. His wife had passed unexpectedly 10 years earlier, and since then the ranch which he had inherited from his father had been both his sanctuary and his prison. Every morning Thomas woke before dawn. The rooster's crow was never enough to rouse him. He had his own rhythm, guided by responsibility. He dressed quickly in worn jeans and a faded shirt, boots heavy with mud from yesterday's work. Breakfast was simple, bread, butter, and coffee, but even that small meal often went untasted. He had grown used to eating alone, the silence of the empty house pressing against him like a constant companion. After breakfast, he moved to the barn. His hands were calloused and strong, accustomed to years of lifting hay bales, mending fences, and guiding stubborn animals. The smell of hay, sweat, and leather filled his senses, comforting in a way he could not explain. He fed the cattle one by one, speaking to them quietly, almost as if they were friends who understood his heart. It was strange, some might say, but to Thomas these creatures were family. Still, there was no one to share a word of encouragement or a smile, no one to laugh with at the small absurdities of life on the ranch. The town nearby was small, only a few streets lined with wooden shops and a general store that had not changed much in decades. Thomas went into town sometimes, usually to buy supplies or deliver goods, but he often felt like an outsider. People were polite, nodding their heads in greeting, yet there was an invisible distance between him and them. They saw him as the lonely rancher, a man too old for romance, too focused on work to care for friendship or community. Children ran past, unaware of his presence, while adults whispered quietly, assuming he could not hear them. These moments reminded him of the isolation he carried in his chest, a weight heavier than any bundle of hay. It was during one of these trips to town that Thomas first heard about the mail-order bride system. The idea came to him quietly, almost reluctantly. At first he dismissed it. How could such a thing work? But as he returned home that evening, watching the sun dip below the hills, he realized how deep his longing for companionship ran. He wanted someone to share meals with, someone to laugh with on quiet nights, someone to hold even when words failed. He wanted a life that was more than endless work, more than the sound of the wind through the tall grass. The process began with careful thought. Thomas sat by his fireplace each night, reading letters from women who sought new beginnings. Some were young, bright-eyed, full of hope, but he could not connect with them. They wanted wealth or social status, or they were frightened of the isolation that came with life on a remote ranch. Best. Then he began to see letters from women closer to his age, women who had experienced loss or hardship, who longed for simplicity and honesty. These letters made his heart lift in a way it had not in years. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. One letter in particular caught his attention. It was from a woman named Margaret, a quiet, gentle soul who had been rejected by previous suitors for being too old according to the rigid expectations of the system. Her words were humble yet filled with strength. She spoke of her life in a small town far away, of the difficulties she had faced, and of her dream to find a place where she could belong. Thomas read her letter again and again, each time feeling an unexpected warmth in his chest. He recognized in her words a reflection of his own heart, the loneliness, the desire for connection, and the simple yearning to be accepted for who he was.
Arrangements were made slowly. cautiously.
Thomas did not want to rush, fearing the disappointment that had touched both their lives before. He prepared his home, cleaning and repairing, ensuring the rooms were welcoming. Breath. He tended to the garden, fixed the fence by the barn, and even polished the floorboards of the old house. Every action was done with care, as if he could create an environment that would speak of his sincerity without a single word. He wanted her to feel welcome, to feel that she could be at peace there. The day of her arrival was filled with anticipation. Thomas paced the porch, listening to the sound of hooves on the dirt road. The wind carried the faint smell of horses and dust, signaling that the journey was near its end. He adjusted his shirt nervously, not caring if the sun reflected off his sweat-streaked face. His heart beat with a mix of hope and anxiety. Round. He was about to meet someone who had also faced rejection, someone who understood loneliness as deeply as he did. Would she see him for who he truly was? Would she find trust in the quiet man who had spent years in solitude? When the carriage arrived, Thomas stepped forward. The woman stepped down slowly, her eyes scanning the ranch with a mixture of curiosity and caution. For so she was not young by the world's standards, but her presence carried a quiet dignity that immediately caught Thomas's attention. Her smile was small but genuine, and he felt a rare sense of connection, as if the universe had conspired to bring them together. He offered his hand and she took it, their fingers brushing briefly in a gesture that spoke of mutual understanding. Words were unnecessary at that moment. Their hearts seemed to speak to each other without sound. The first evening was simple. Thomas prepared a modest meal and they ate together at the wooden table in the kitchen. Conversation was tentative at first, filled with pauses and shy glances. They spoke of mundane things, weather, the cattle, the town. But in those small exchanges, trust began to form. Each smile, each shared laugh, was a brick in the foundation of a new life. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a sense of anticipation for the days ahead, a lightness he had long thought impossible. As night fell, they stepped onto the porch together. The stars stretched across the sky like scattered diamonds, and the quiet of the land wrapped around them. Thomas felt a surge of emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Here, standing beside someone who understood his past and his pain, he realized that loneliness was not something to endure. It was something to transform. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had found the person who could help him do so. Sleep came slowly that night, but it was filled with comfort. Thomas lay in his bed listening to the distant sound of cattle, and for the first time he did not feel completely alone. Across the room, Margaret settled into her bed, her heart quietly accepting the possibility of a new beginning. Both had been scarred by life. Both had faced rejection and disappointment. Yet in this moment, there was hope. The ranch, once a symbol of isolation, now felt like a place of potential and promise. The days that followed were filled with careful exploration. Margaret learned the rhythm of ranch life, the early mornings, the long walks across the fields, the patience required to tend to animals. Bus, in turn, learned the subtle art of companionship, how to share silence without discomfort, how to speak with kindness, how to allow someone else into a life that had once been exclusively his own. Breath smelt. Each day brought small victories: a repaired fence, a new garden sprouting, a shared cup of coffee at sunrise. Each victory strengthened the bond forming between them, a quiet testament to resilience and hope. Yet despite these small joys, the shadow of the past lingered. Thomas worried about the townspeople's judgment, about Margaret's past rejections, about whether they could truly belong together. Nights were sometimes restless, filled with doubt, but the following mornings always brought reassurance. They laughed over minor mishaps, supported each other in small frustrations, and discovered a shared humor that lightened the weight of their experiences. Slowly, trust began to replace fear, and the seeds of love were planted in the rich soil of understanding and shared life. By the end of the first month, the transformation was subtle but undeniable. Thomas no longer felt the crushing weight of loneliness, and Margaret no longer feared a life defined by rejection. Together, they had created a small but meaningful world, one of work, laughter, shared responsibility, and emerging affection. The ranch, which had once echoed with silence, now hummed with life, hope, and the quiet promise of what could be. Though the journey ahead was still uncertain, the first steps had been taken. Desk. Two souls, scarred by life and weary from disappointment, had found each other on the vast plains. And in that discovery there was a simple truth. Sometimes hope arrives in unexpected ways, and when it does, it can transform even the loneliest of places into a home filled with warmth, connection, and the quiet beginnings of love. Margaret had traveled far to reach the ranch, carrying with her not just a suitcase of clothes but a heart full of hope and hesitation. She had been rejected before, returned by families or men who believed she was too old to start a new life with them. Each rejection had left a quiet ache in her soul, a fear that perhaps she would never find a place where she truly belonged. But when she met Thomas, something in his gentle eyes and quiet manners told her that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The first few days were filled with adjustments. Margaret had never lived on a working ranch before, and every task seemed bigger and harder than she expected. She struggled to lift hay bales as high as Thomas did, tripped over uneven boards in the barn, and was startled by the sudden lowing of the cattle. Thomas watched patiently, offering guidance without a word of criticism. He showed her how to carry water buckets without spilling, how to feed the animals in an orderly fashion, and how to tend to the garden that was slowly taking shape behind the house.
Each day was a new challenge, but Margaret faced them with determination.
She refused to let fear or doubt control her actions. In the evenings, when the work was done and the sun dipped behind the hills, they would sit on the porch. Sometimes there was silence, filled only with the sound of wind through the trees and the distant calls of animals. Other times, they would talk quietly about their pasts, sharing small pieces of themselves that they had never told anyone before. Margaret spoke of her childhood in a small town far away, where she had dreamed of a simple life but had always felt out of place. She shared stories of failed attempts to start over, of letters sent and returned, of hope that had faded and rekindled again. Thomas listened attentively, never interrupting, offering a comforting presence that made her feel seen and heard. Thomas, in turn, began to open up about his own life. He spoke of his late wife, of the sudden emptiness that had followed her death, and of the long years he had spent tending to the ranch alone. He told Margaret about the quiet nights when he would sit by the fireplace and imagine a life that could be shared with someone he loved. These conversations were not easy for him. He had always been reserved, careful with his emotions, but with Margaret, he felt a sense of trust he had not felt in years. He began to realize that loneliness could be shared, and that sharing could bring unexpected comfort. Despite the growing connection between them, challenges remained. The town was not always welcoming, and whispers of gossip followed them when they ventured to the general store or the post office. Some townspeople looked at Margaret with suspicion, questioning why she had come so far and why she had been returned by other men. Others assumed Thomas must be desperate, settling for someone who had been rejected. These murmurs were hurtful, but they also strengthened the bond between the two. They learned to rely on each other, to ignore the judgment of others, and to create a small world where they could feel safe and valued. One day, a misunderstanding tested their trust. A calf had gone missing, wandering beyond the fence, and Thomas feared it had been lost for good. Margaret, determined to help, insisted on searching the fields with him. They walked for hours under the scorching sun, calling out for the animal, their voices carrying across the plains. Tired and frustrated, they finally spotted the calf near a creek, tangled in some brush. Working together, they freed it and guided it back to safety. That moment, though small, became symbolic of their partnership. They realized that together they could face difficulties they could not handle alone, and that trust and teamwork were essential to building a life together. Over time, their bond deepened. Margaret learned the rhythm of the ranch, rising with the sun and working alongside Thomas in a way that felt natural. She began to anticipate the needs of the cattle, noticing subtle changes in their behavior and helping Thomas with chores that required more than one pair of hands. Thomas, in turn, began to notice the small but meaningful ways Margaret contributed to the household, how she kept the kitchen organized, tended to the garden, and even found small ways to decorate the house to make it feel warmer and more inviting. These contributions, though simple, spoke volumes about her care and dedication, and Thomas felt gratitude and admiration growing in his heart. The quiet moments were just as important as the work. On some evenings, they would watch the sunset together, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. Margaret would lean against Thomas, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, while he felt the gentle warmth of her presence. Sometimes they would speak of the future, imagining a life filled with companionship, shared responsibilities, and simple joys. They did not rush these conversations, for both knew that trust and love were built gradually, like the careful construction of a fence that would withstand storms. Yet despite the growing affection, there was still fear lingering in their hearts. Margaret worried that Thomas might one day regret choosing her, that he might wish for someone younger or more energetic. Thomas, too, feared that Margaret's past rejections would eventually return to haunt them, that the town's judgment might drive a wedge between them. They shared these fears one evening, sitting quietly on the porch, the stars beginning to twinkle above. Margaret reached for Thomas's hand, and he held it gently, realizing that their connection was stronger than any doubt. In that small gesture they found reassurance and courage to continue forward together. One turning point came when Margaret discovered an old photo of Thomas's late wife. She did not shy away from it. Instead, she asked about her, listened to stories, and shared in his memories. But Thomas was surprised at how comfortable he felt speaking about the past with her, and he realized that sharing these memories did not lessen his feelings for her, but instead strengthened the bond they were building. Margaret's understanding and acceptance of his history made him feel valued and loved in a way he had never experienced before. As the weeks passed, the townspeople began to notice the changes as well. Though some continued to whisper, others could see the genuine connection between Thomas and Margaret. They observed the way they worked together, laughed together, and supported each other through the daily challenges of ranch life. For Cayetone, slowly, skepticism began to fade, replaced by quiet admiration. The couple did not seek validation from others, but the growing respect of the community provided a sense of belonging that had long been missing from both their lives. Margaret also began to find joy in the simple pleasures of ranch life. She discovered the satisfaction of planting seeds and watching them grow, of tending to the animals with care, and of contributing to a household where her efforts were appreciated. She reveled in the small victories, like mending a broken fence, fixing a leaky roof, or successfully preparing a hearty meal after a long day of work. These accomplishments, though humble, brought a sense of purpose and fulfillment that had been absent in her previous life. Thomas, too, was transformed by her presence. He began to take more pleasure in daily routines, noticing small details he had overlooked before. The way the morning light fell across the fields, the sound of birds at dawn, the warmth of a shared meal. He laughed more easily, smiled more freely, and allowed himself to hope for a future that had once seemed impossible. Margaret's companionship brought color and light into his life, dispelling years of loneliness and opening his heart to the possibility of love. One evening after a long day of work, Thomas and Margaret sat together on the porch, sharing a quiet meal. The sky was painted in deep shades of purple and gold, and the air was filled with the scent of grass and earth. Thomas looked at Margaret and felt a surge of emotion. He realized that he did not want to live another day without her by his side, that her presence had become essential to his happiness. He took a deep breath and, with a quiet certainty, spoke words that had been forming in his heart for weeks. "Then just be mine!" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but of relief and joy. She had feared rejection, feared judgment, feared that her past would prevent her from finding love. But in Thomas's words, she heard sincerity, acceptance, and a promise of companionship. She reached for his hand, gripping it firmly, and whispered softly, "I will." In that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them, a recognition that despite the hardships, despite the past, they had found each other and chosen to build a life together. From that day forward, life on the ranch took on a new rhythm. Their partnership became stronger, not just through shared work, but through mutual respect, trust, and the slow unfolding of love. They learned to anticipate each other's needs, to communicate without words, and to celebrate the small joys of life together.
Every sunrise brought new possibilities, every sunset a reminder of their shared journey. Though challenges remained, the occasional storm, the demands of the ranch, and the lingering judgment of some townspeople, Thomas and Margaret faced them together.
They understood that life would never be perfect, but they had found something more valuable. A true partnership built on trust, understanding, and the courage to open their hearts despite past wounds. As the months passed, the once lonely ranch became a home filled with warmth, laughter, and quiet contentment. Margaret and Thomas had discovered that love does not always come in the ways we expect, nor at the times we plan. Sometimes it arrives quietly, patiently, and with the power to transform lives that had long been shaped by solitude and disappointment. And in each other they had found a companion, a partner, and a love that promised to endure, no matter what the future might hold. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm for Thomas and Margaret, a rhythm that was full of work, small joys, and a growing sense of togetherness. Each day was a mixture of tasks that required strength, patience, and cooperation. Margaret had learned quickly how to care for the animals and maintain the property, and Thomas found himself relying on her more than he ever expected.
He realized that the ranch was no longer just a place to survive. It was becoming a home because she was there.
They began each morning early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as they moved together across the fields. Margaret carried water for the horses, while Thomas fed the cattle. Their movements became synchronized, almost like a dance born out of necessity and understanding. But they would exchange small words of encouragement, laugh at minor mistakes, and celebrate small victories, like guiding a stubborn calf back into the pen or repairing a section of fence that had fallen during a storm. Every success, no matter how small, strengthened their bond and gave them confidence that they could face bigger challenges together. One morning, Margaret noticed a patch of the garden struggling to grow. The soil had become too dry and the plants were wilting under the harsh sun. She told Thomas about it, suggesting they work together to water and care for the plants more carefully. Thomas listened and agreed, but he also added that they could try planting some new seeds that were better suited to the soil and climate. Together they tilled the earth, planted fresh seeds, and watered them carefully, laughing when dirt got on their hands and clothes. Over the next few weeks, they watched as the plants began to sprout, a small but visible sign of their combined effort and teamwork. Their relationship deepened not only through shared work, but also through moments of quiet companionship, breaths. Some evenings they would sit on the porch in silence, the wind whispering through the trees, the sound of the cattle lowing in the distance. At times they would speak softly, sharing thoughts about the future or reflecting on their pasts. Margaret spoke about her family, her childhood, and the dreams she had once held. Thomas shared memories of his late wife, the joys of raising cattle, and the challenges of managing the ranch alone. Through these conversations, they learned to trust each other, to understand each other's fears, and to celebrate each other's strengths. Humor also became an important part of their life together. Thomas discovered that Margaret had a sharp wit and a playful side, which often made him laugh in ways he had not in years. They would tease each other lightly, joke about the difficulties of ranch work, or make fun of minor mishaps, like spilling milk or tripping over a garden hose. These moments of laughter created a sense of ease and comfort, reminding them both that life could be joyful even amidst hard work and responsibility. Challenges were still present, but they faced them together. One particularly harsh storm tested their resolve. Heavy rain poured down for hours, flooding parts of the fields and creating deep puddles along the paths. A section of the fence near the pasture had collapsed, leaving the cattle at risk of wandering into dangerous areas. Thomas and Margaret worked side by side, lifting fallen boards, securing posts, and guiding the animals to safety. The storm was exhausting, soaking them through and leaving them muddy, but they found satisfaction in having solved the problem together. That night, they shared a warm meal by candlelight, laughing at how drenched and tired they looked. It was a moment that reminded them of the strength they had found in each other. Margaret also began to integrate herself more into the routines of the ranch. She learned how to mend torn blankets for the animals, how to check the fences for weak spots, and even how to prepare meals that could be carried to the fields for long days of work. Thomas noticed her growing confidence and skill, and he felt a deep respect for her determination. Breaths was not just comforting, but essential to the smooth running of the ranch. She had become his partner in the truest sense. Someone who shared not only his home but also his responsibilities and dreams. As they grew closer, they began to make small plans for the future. Margaret suggested planting more crops, expanding the garden, and adding a small orchard to the land. Thomas, who had always been cautious about change, listened carefully and agreed. They mapped out their ideas together, imagining a ranch that was not only productive but also beautiful and welcoming. This vision gave them something to work toward, a shared goal that strengthened their partnership and deepened their sense of belonging. Their love, though quiet and steady, continued to grow, but it was not the fiery passion of youth, but a calm, enduring connection built on trust, respect, and shared experiences. Thomas found himself thinking about Margaret throughout the day, looking forward to her smile, her laughter, and her thoughtful presence. Margaret, in turn, felt a sense of security and peace she had never known. She knew that Thomas valued her not only for her abilities, but for her heart and her character. They had both found in each other something they had long sought, a companion who accepted them fully, flaws and all. The townspeople, too, began to notice the change. Slowly, skepticism gave way to admiration. People saw how the couple worked together, how they cared for the animals, and how they supported each other through daily challenges.
Even those who had once whispered doubts began to treat them with respect. Thomas and Margaret did not seek approval, but the growing acceptance of the community reinforced their sense of belonging and strengthened their commitment to each other.
One afternoon, a traveling family arrived at the ranch, bringing news of a distant fair and inviting Thomas and Margaret to visit. It was a chance for them to see the world beyond the ranch, to meet new people, and to enjoy a brief respite from their work. Margaret was excited at the prospect, and Thomas, though hesitant at first, agreed. They traveled together, navigating new experiences and sharing small moments of joy along the way. The trip reminded them that their bond was not limited to the ranch. They could face the wider world together, supporting and encouraging one another through unfamiliar challenges.
Back on the ranch, they continued to build a life that was rich with meaning.
They celebrated small milestones, such as the first successful harvest from the garden, the birth of a new calf, or a repaired section of fence that had caused them worry. These moments, though simple, were deeply satisfying because they were shared. Both. Each achievement reinforced their partnership and gave them confidence that they could overcome larger challenges together. The couple also found ways to connect emotionally and spiritually. They would sit by the fireplace on cold winter evenings, sharing stories from their childhoods, discussing hopes for the future, and reflecting on the lessons they had learned. Margaret began to teach Thomas small things from her past, like cooking techniques or ways to care for the home more efficiently. Thomas, in turn, shared practical knowledge about ranch management and animal care. Through these exchanges, they learned to value each other's strengths and to find balance in their partnership. As seasons changed, their love matured further. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The garden bloomed, the animals grew healthier, and the landscape itself seemed to rejoice in their care. Summer days were long and filled with work, but they also brought opportunities for laughter, exploration, and quiet reflection. Autumn was a time for harvest, shared meals, and preparation for the colder months ahead. Winter, though harsh and challenging, became a season for warmth, conversation, and the comfort of each other's presence. Through every season, they faced challenges and joys side by side, learning to rely on each other completely. One evening, as they watched the sun set over the hills, Thomas turned to Margaret and smiled. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for her presence, for her patience, and for the love they had nurtured together. Margaret, looking back at him, felt the same, a quiet, enduring love that had grown from shared work, shared struggles, and shared hope. They knew that life would not always be easy, but they had discovered the strength to face it together. Their partnership was now unshakable, built on trust, respect, and the simple joy of being there for each other. The ranch, once a symbol of solitude and hardship, had become a place of warmth, purpose, and connection. Thomas and Margaret had learned that love is not always dramatic or sudden. Sometimes it grows quietly, through shared experiences, patience, and understanding. They had discovered that companionship is as much about being present in ordinary moments as it is about celebrating extraordinary ones. And in each other they had found a home that was both physical and emotional, a place where they belonged, where they were valued, and where they could face the future with hope. As the night settled over the plains, the couple sat together on the porch, hands entwined, listening to the distant calls of the cattle and the whisper of the wind through the grasses. They did not need words to express their feelings. The quiet comfort of being together spoke volumes. Each had found in the other a partner who was reliable, compassionate, and steadfast, a companion for life. And in that discovery, they knew that they had built something rare and enduring, a love that could weather storms, celebrate victories, and bring meaning to every day, no matter how ordinary or challenging. Life on the ranch was not perfect, and it never would be. There were still storms to face, fences to repair, and animals to care for. There were still moments of doubt and fatigue, moments when the long workdays felt overwhelming. But now, with each other to lean on, Thomas and Margaret faced every challenge with courage and optimism. They had learned that together they could overcome obstacles that seemed impossible alone. And they had learned that love is strongest when it is built on shared effort, respect, and the willingness to support one another through all of life's ups and downs. Through work, laughter, struggle, and quiet reflection, Thomas and Margaret had grown into a partnership that was steady, meaningful, and enduring. They had discovered that love is not measured by passion alone, but by the small, consistent acts of care, patience, and understanding that build a life together. And as they looked out over the fields they tended, the home they shared, and the animals they cared for, they knew that their bond had created something beautiful, a life filled with hope, joy, and the quiet, lasting strength of true companionship. The years on the ranch passed quietly but meaningfully for Thomas and Margaret. Their lives, once shaped by loneliness and rejection, had grown into something steady, comforting, and deeply fulfilling. The ranch, which had once felt like a lonely expanse of land, now echoed with the warmth of partnership. Every corner of the home, every stretch of pasture, every small flower in the garden was touched by their care and shared effort. Together, they had turned isolation into companionship, struggle into strength, and longing into love. Life continued with its rhythms, predictable yet full of small surprises. Mornings were still early, with the soft light of dawn spilling across the fields, but now they were greeted with a sense of purpose and joy, rather than a dull weight of solitude. Margaret would prepare breakfast while Thomas fed the animals, the two exchanging smiles and small jokes. Their mornings were punctuated with laughter over spilled coffee or clumsy attempts to catch a wayward chicken. These small moments became the heartbeat of their life together. tiny pieces of happiness that reminded them why they had chosen each other. The town, which had once treated Thomas with polite distance and curiosity about Margaret's arrival, gradually began to accept and respect them. Neighbors who had once whispered doubts now nodded greetings warmly.
Shopkeepers offered extra help or advice, sometimes lingering for a brief conversation about the ranch. Children, who had once run past without a second glance, now waved and asked questions about the animals or the crops.
Slowly, Thomas and Margaret realized that their love and partnership had not only transformed their lives, but had quietly won over the community.
They were no longer the subjects of judgment, but examples of perseverance, trust, and the quiet beauty of a shared life.
Margaret had grown confident in her place on the ranch. She understood the needs of the animals and had her own methods for tending to them, often anticipating problems before they arose. She became skilled in gardening, learning which seeds would flourish in each season, and she began expanding the garden with small plots of flowers and vegetables. Thomas admired her initiative and creativity, often marveling at how she brought life and color to both the land and their home. He felt grateful every day for her presence, not only because of the work she did, but because of the love and care she poured into every task. Their partnership also strengthened through challenges, both expected and unexpected. One summer, a sudden dry spell threatened the crops, and they had to work together to conserve water, rearrange irrigation, and ensure that the animals had enough to drink. During long afternoons under the hot sun, they supported each other physically and emotionally, encouraging patience, problem-solving, and resilience. Each challenge they overcame brought a quiet sense of achievement, not only in practical results but in the understanding that together they could face difficulties that had once seemed insurmountable. Margaret and Thomas also found ways to nurture their emotional connection alongside their work. On evenings when the chores were done, they would sit on the porch watching the sun set across the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Sometimes they spoke, sharing memories, hopes, and dreams. Sometimes they were silent, content in the presence of each other. Their hands would find each other's, their fingers intertwining naturally, a silent affirmation of partnership, trust, and enduring affection. These quiet rituals became the anchor of their relationship, moments to pause and reflect on how far they had come together. Small celebrations became part of life on the ranch. The first successful harvest of a new crop, a calf born healthy and strong, or a repaired section of fence were all occasions for gratitude and quiet joy. They marked these events with a special meal or a shared toast, sometimes laughing at minor mishaps along the way. Even mundane moments like tending to the garden or painting a fence were infused with companionship and mutual respect. Through these shared experiences, they realized that happiness often came not from grand events, but from the steady accumulation of small, meaningful moments spent together. Over time, they also began to welcome friends and family to the ranch. Margaret occasionally invited distant relatives or old acquaintances, and Thomas sometimes brought neighbors or traveling ranchers who needed a place to stay. The home, once quiet and solitary, now had life and warmth. The couple learned to balance privacy and hospitality, cherishing moments alone while also enjoying the company of others. The ranch became a place of connection, where visitors could feel the warmth of genuine care and see firsthand the love that had blossomed between Thomas and Margaret.
One autumn, as the leaves turned shades of gold and red, Thomas and Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them together.
They remembered the early days, Margaret's uncertainty, Thomas's quiet loneliness, and the first sparks of connection that had grown into trust and affection. They spoke openly about their fears, acknowledging how rejection and isolation had shaped them, and how they had overcome those challenges through patience, understanding, and a willingness to open their hearts. The conversation reminded them that love was not something that could be rushed or forced. It grew gradually, nurtured by shared experience, care, and mutual respect. Their bond deepened even further as they worked on long-term projects around the ranch, They repaired old barns, built new fences, and planted orchards that would bear fruit for years to come.
Each project required cooperation, planning, and compromise, reinforcing the sense of partnership that had become the foundation of their life.
They celebrated each success together, not just as achievements in themselves, but as evidence of what they could accomplish when they worked as one. These shared victories strengthened their confidence in the future and in the durability of their relationship. Despite their successes, life on the ranch was not without its hardships. Harsh weather, animal illnesses, and the occasional equipment failure tested their resilience. Yet, in each challenge, they found strength in their partnership. Margaret's calm reasoning often balanced Thomas's practical decisiveness, and Thomas's steady support reassured Margaret when tasks seemed overwhelming. They learned to communicate effectively, to share responsibility, and to face difficulties with patience and teamwork. But in doing so, they discovered that love is not only about companionship in easy moments, but also about standing together through trials, solving problems as a unit, and remaining steadfast when life tests you. As winter settled over the plains, they spent long evenings indoors, finding comfort in one another's presence. They read books aloud, shared stories from their pasts, and planned for the future. Thomas taught Margaret practical skills for handling emergencies on the ranch, while Margaret introduced him to hobbies and small creative projects that brought enjoyment beyond work. Through these shared activities, they nurtured not only their daily life, but also the emotional and intellectual bond that had grown steadily over the years. By spring, the ranch was thriving. Crops flourished, the animals were healthy, and the home radiated warmth and care. Margaret and Thomas took pride in what they had built together, recognizing that their life was not just about survival or routine, but about the deep satisfaction of shared purpose. They knew that the foundation of their happiness was trust, respect, and the ongoing effort to care for each other, the land, and the life they had chosen to build together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the hills, Thomas took Margaret's hand and spoke softly. "We have come a long way together. I cannot imagine life without you." Margaret smiled, her eyes reflecting both joy and gratitude.
"Neither can I," she replied. "We have built something real, something strong, and something that lasts."
In that moment, they understood fully that their love had matured into a steady, unwavering presence in each other's lives. A bond that would endure through whatever challenges might come. They had discovered that age, past rejection, or the judgment of others could not define their happiness. What mattered was their commitment, their shared effort, and the quiet moments of connection that built the life they wanted. Their love was not dramatic or rushed. It was steady, patient, and deeply rooted in understanding and care. It was the kind of love that could weather storms, endure challenges, and grow richer over time. The ranch, once a lonely expanse, had become a sanctuary. Every corner reflected their shared care. The garden where they worked side by side, the barns maintained together, the freshly painted fence that marked the edge of the property, and the cozy rooms of their home filled with warmth and comfort. Visitors would often remark on the peace and balance they felt there, sensing the deep connection that Thomas and Margaret had cultivated through years of shared life. As the sun set over the hills, casting long shadows across the fields, Thomas and Margaret stood side by side, hands entwined, hearts aligned. They watched the animals return to the barn, the wind rustling gently through the grasses, and the sky fading into shades of pink and purple. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a recognition of everything they had endured, and everything they had built together. They had turned loneliness into companionship, rejection into acceptance, and hardship into shared strength. Through all the seasons, the ranch had witnessed the growth of their love. Spring brought renewal and growth. Summer brought hard work and laughter. Autumn brought reflection and gratitude, and winter brought warmth and togetherness. In each season they found lessons, joys, and opportunities to strengthen their bond. Their life together was a testament to resilience, patience, and the quiet power of love that grows steadily through shared experience and understanding. In the end, Thomas and Margaret had not only found each other, they had found a life filled with meaning, hope, and lasting joy. They had learned that true happiness does not come from wealth, youth, or societal approval. It comes from connection, trust, shared effort, and the willingness to embrace life together, no matter what challenges arise. Their story, once marked by loneliness and rejection, had transformed into a testament to the enduring power of love, patience, and the quiet fulfillment of two hearts choosing each other every day. As night fully settled over the ranch, the stars twinkled above like tiny beacons of hope and possibility. Thomas and Margaret sat together on the porch, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence. There were no grand declarations or dramatic gestures, just the simple, profound comfort of being together, knowing they had built a life that was truly theirs. In the quiet of the plains, with the wind whispering through the grasses and the animals settled for the night, they knew that they had found what so many search for but few truly discover: a home in each other's hearts, and a love that would last for the rest of their days.